Good day, Mr. Falayo. So today, we're gonna discuss our semifinal applying Kant's categorical imperative, which is to real-life ethical dilemmas. So here are my group mates, which is I am Rogelio Palabrica. I am the presenter and creative designer in this report. So and then Navida Ian, which is my devil's advocate, and my Jake Lawrence Irabon, which is my scenario developer and Kantian analyst. So the first is objective. To evaluate and guide moral actions by applying Kant's categorical imperative, ensuring that decisions are made based on universal moral laws, respect for human dignity and the consistency of ethical principles rather than personal consequences or subjective preferences. Applying Kant's categorical imperative is to evaluate action based on universal moral principles rather than consequences. This involves ensuring that ones can be willed as universal laws, respecting the intrinsic worth of all individuals, and upholding consistency and rationality in moral decision making. It serves as a foundation for ethical reasoning in education, research, and practical situations. So our introduction is Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative stands as cornerstone of deontological ethics, emphasizing the importance of duty, moral law, and rational consistency in ethical decision making. Unlike consequentialist theories, Kantian ethics asserts that the morality of an action depends on not on its outcomes but on whether it adheres a universal moral law that respects inherent dignity of all individuals. Applying the categorical imperative involves asking whether one's action could be universally applied without contradiction and whether they treat others as an ends in themselves, not merely as a means to an end. This ethical framework remains influential and relevant in addressing modern moral challenges across personal, social, and professional contexts. So, here our scenario. A man's child is gravely ill and he cannot afford the medicine that could save her life. The pharmacy refuses to give it to him without payment. Desperate, he considers stealing the medicine. So, applying the tree formulation. So, our Kantian analysis on that, which is the first is universalizability. If this maxim were universalized, the concept of property would be undermined. Pharmacists might refuse to stock expensive medicine, fearing theft in emergencies. This would lead to a contradiction in the purpose of private property and legal system, making the maxim self-defeating. Therefore, the action fails the test of universalizability. So our conclusion on that, which is Kant would reject the action as it fails strict universalizability. However, nuanced interpretation open debate how rigid or flexible moral laws should be in life and death situations. So, we move to respect for person and ends. Sealing undermines the autonomy of the pharmacist by denying them the right to choose whether to help. According to Kant, this violates their capacity for moral legislation and treats them merely as a means. True moral action in Kant's views must respect the autonomy of all individuals and follow laws one could will for everyone, regardless of consequences. Thus, Kant would argue that even in emergencies, moral laws must be upheld to preserve human dignity and moral freedom of all for all. So in our conclusion on that, which is Kantian ethics emphasizes duty and principle over consequences. So even life-saving motives do not override the obligation to act according to universal moral law. So autonomy in moral legislation. Stealing undermines the autonomy of the pharmacist by denying them the right to choose whether to help. True moral actions in Kant's view must respect the autonomy of all individuals and follow one good will be for everyone regardless of consequences. So our conclusion are that applying Kant's categorical imperative to the scenario of stealing medicine to save a life reveals a deep tension between moral duty and emotional urgency. From Kantian perspective, the act is impermissible because if it fails the test of universality, respect for person and autonomy, stealing, even with good intentions, cannot be held as a universal law and treats others as mere means by overriding their moral agency. Okay, let's proceed to our critic devil's advocate, which is the violation of universal law. Kant claims that stealing cannot be universalized because it will undermine the institution of private property. However, a devil's advocate could argue that this is too rigid. The universal law tends not to be applied to all stealing, but rather to stealing under extreme, life-threatening circumstances. The proposed maxim one may take what is necessary to preserve life when no legal means are available could be universalized in a way that respect to broader moral structure and human dignity. So the second is challenge to violation of universal law. Objection, practicality. Critics argue that the application of universal law can be impractical in real-world situations. For instance, the maxim always tell the truth may lead to harmful consequences in situations where lying could prevent harm, such as protecting someone from emotional distress. This objection highlights the rigidity of Kant's framework, suggesting that the moral decision often require flexibility and consideration of context. So, example, a pertinent example of violation of universal law can be illustrated through the case of lying to protect someone. Suppose a person lies to a friend about their partner's fidelity to spare their feelings. According to Kant's formula, this action would be impermissible because the maxim it is acceptable to lie to protect someone's feelings cannot be universalized without contradiction. If everyone lied in such situations, trust would be eroded, the concept of truth would be meaningless. Thus, the violation of universal law is evident the tension between the intent to protect and the moral law obligation to be truthful. So our conclusion on that, while the concept of universal law provides a foundational framework for moral reasoning, is it met with substantial objections regarding its practicality, cultural applicability, and the need for a consequentialist perspective. Real-life moral dilemmas often reveal the limitation of rigid adherence to universal maxims, suggesting that ethical decision-making may require a more nuanced approach that considers consequences and cultural diversity. This ongoing debate underscores the complexity of moral philosophy and the necessity for dialogue between different ethical frameworks. So let's go to treating humanity as an end, not as means. Objections. Conflicting duties situation often arise where seemingly unavoidable conflicts occur between treating someone as an end and achieving other morally important goals. For example, a doctor might need to use patients' organs, treating them as a means to save the lives of several others. This creates a conflict between respecting individual autonomy and maximizing overall well-being. So the example which is a clear violation of this principle would be human trafficking. Traffickers exploit individuals, treating them solely as commodities to be bought and sold for profit. The victims are deprived of their autonomy, dignity, and basic human rights. They are reduced to instruments for the traffickers' gain, completely disregarding their inherent worth as a human beings. Their value is solely determined by their market price and ability to generate profit. So our conclusion in that, which is, while Kant's principle provides a powerful ethical ideal, its implementation presents significant challenges. The objections highlight the complexities of balancing competing moral values and the difficulty of applying abstract principles to real-world scenarios, the principle remains a valuable ethical framework but needs careful consideration and nuanced application to avoid impractical rigidity. Finding practical ways to integrate this idea to societal structures in individual action remains an ongoing ethical challenge. And consequences of the action. Objections. Predictability. Accurately predicting the consequence of action is often extremely difficult if not impossible. Unforeseen circumstances and cascading effects can render even the most careful predictions inaccurate. Relying solely on predicting consequences can lead to unintended and harmful outcomes. So the example which is consider a scenario where a government decides to implement a policy that significantly boosts the national economy but results in the marginalization and impoverishment of a specific minority group. From a purely consequentialist perspective, if the overall economic benefit outweighs the suffering of the minority, the policy might be considered morally acceptable. However, that ignores an injustice and ethical violation inherent in sacrificing the well-being of a group for the benefit of the majority. The focus on the overall positive consequences overlooks the negative consequences for a specific segment of the population and the ethical implication of such disappropriate impact. So the conclusion is, while considering the consequences of action is essential for responsible decision making, relying solely on them as the sole determinant of morality presents considerable challenges. The inherent difficulties in predicting outcomes, the neglect of intentions, potential conflicts with the justice and individual rights, and the problem of measuring good consequences all highlight the limitation of a purely consequentialist approach. A more comprehensive ethical framework needs to integrate considerations of consequences with other relevant factors such as intentions, justice, and respect for individual rights. So, the lack of contextual flexibility. Objection. Oversimplification of the complex issues. Real-world ethical dilemmas are rarely straightforward. They involve intricate webs of factors, relationships, and potential consequences. Ignoring context oversimplifies the complexities and risks producing simplistic and inadequate solutions. So the example is, consider a rule against lying while generally beneficial. Rigidly adhering to this rule without considering context can be problematic. Lying to protect someone from imminent danger, for example, might be considered morally justifiable despite violating the rule against lying. The act of lying itself is judged differently of the light of the life or death context. The lack of contextual flexibility would lead to a judgment of the act as inherently wrong regardless of a potentially life-saving consequences. So the conclusion is, the lack of contextual flexibility in applying an ethical principle is a significant limitation. Ethical decision-making requires a nuanced approach that considers the specific facts, circumstances, and cultural context of each situation. While general rules and principles provide a valuable guidance, a rigid adherence to them without considering the nuances of the context can lead to unfair, ineffective, and even harmful outcomes. The ability to adapt ethical principles to specific situations is crucial for responsible and effective moral reasoning. And last but not the least, the overemphasis on rationality and duty. Objections. Neglect of emotion and intuition. Human beings are not purely rational creatures. Emotions and intuition also play vital roles in moral and judgment. In decision making, dismissing these aspects leads to a cold and potentially humane approach to ethics and richness, complexity of human experience. Example, consider a scenario where a person faced with a choice between betraying a friend to save their own life and facing certain death by remaining loyal. A strict deontological approach might emphasize the duty of loyalty regardless of the potentially fatal consequences. However, this ignores the crucial contextual factor of self-preservation and the emotional weight of the situation. A more balanced approach would consider both the duty of loyalty and the very real consequences of choosing to prioritize it over self-preservation. The rigidity of focusing solely on rationality and duty would neglect the emotional and self-preservation aspect of the situation. So our conclusion on that, while rationality and duty are essential components of ethical decision making, an overemphasis on them to the exclusion of the other factors such as emotions, intuition, consequences, and cultural context creates a flawed and potentially harmful ethical system. A more comprehensive and balanced framework recognizes the interplay of various factors in moral judgment and allows for flexibility and nuance in navigating the complexities of real-world and ethical dilemmas. So that's all, and thank you for listening.